Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'll be reading from The Green Shore, which is my first novel. It's set in Athens and a little bit in Paris between 1967 and 1973. Most of you, I think this audience might have a sense of what was happening in Greece at the time, but I'll start with the quick and dirty history lesson, I guess. In 1967, April, elections were slated for the following May. The person who was slated to win, or who they thought would come to power, was George Papandreou, the elder, not the one that was just in power. And he was very beloved, very center, and people liked him from all sides, or many sides, I should say. Meanwhile, he had a son named Andrea, who was much more radical, made the Greek establishment a little bit nervous, made the American CIA a little bit nervous, and so this was also happening at the same time. There was political unrest in Greece in general, a lot of protests, etc., and there were a lot of rumors that there would be a coup and the elections would not actually happen. So the rumors of the coup were, some thought that the coup would come from the right, or the king. Others thought that the coup would come from the left, or the communists. Others thought that the coup would come from the generals in the army. But instead, the colonels in the army said, okay, we're going to do this. They rolled their tanks into the streets April 21st, 1967, and kept power basically for 7 years. And so this is the context of where the book is beginning. The family I'm writing about is a fictional family, though it's based very loosely on my father's family. My father came to Detroit in 1966, so right before the year before the coup. And I was always interested in why he came then, what was going on then, what made him leave then, when the rest of his family stayed, his sisters, his parents, his friends, etc. And so that was the context of why I started thinking about this period. And I always wanted to write about Greece, and so after. That said, so the title of the book is The Green Shore, and it comes from a poem by Kostas Kereotakis, who is a fantastic, fantastic Greek poet. He was writing much before this time. He died in 1928, but the title comes from one of his, I think, most beautiful poems called Sleep. And the reason why I chose it is it deals with the idea of exile. And even though I'm writing about Greeks in Greece at the time, I think that a lot of people, when this happened, felt that their country had been ripped away from them. And so they were living in a country that was no longer theirs. Others actually left. Others were sent into exile. And so the theme of exile is something I think about all the time as a writer. Also because many writers just happen to be exiles in some way, and I mean it more in the sense that we might feel like we're outsiders or different, or the weird kid in school who eventually finds their way through writing. And so this is a poem called Sleep, and I thought, like most writers do, I'll start with the words of another writer who's a better, more accomplished writer, and then I'll go into my own work. Sleep. Will the gift and good fortune be granted to us that one night we can go to die, there on the green shore of our native land? Sweetly we shall sleep like little children, sweetly. And up above us all the stars, all worldly things will drift into the sky. Just like a dream, the waves will caress us. And as blue as a wave, our dream will draw us to far countries which do not exist. The breezes will blow like love in our hair. The seaweed's breath will leave its scent on us, and down below our now heavy eyelids, we shall wear a smile. The roses will move down from the hedges, and they'll come to us to be our pillow. The nightingales will give up their own sleep to make sleep more harmonious for us. Sweetly, we shall sleep like little children, sweetly. And the young girls of our village will stand all around us like wild pear trees, and bending down, they'll whisper to us about golden cabins, about the sun on Sunday, about our good years, which are all gone now. A little old woman will hold our hand, and while we're slowly closing our eyes, she, pale, will tell us, like a fairy tale, of the bitterness of life. And the moon will descend to be a candle at our feet, when for the last time we shall fall asleep, there on the green shore of our native land. Sweetly we will sleep like little children who have cried all day, exhausting themselves. And so there's the title. So I'll start reading from a few sections from the beginning of the book, so I don't need to provide a lot of context. And I'm going to begin with the family is a mother named Hellenic. She's a physician, and she's been widowed 10 years before the novel begins. So she's raising 3 teenagers by herself. She's a doctor, she's kind of progressive, and she sort of goes against the grain, so to speak, compared to other Greek women of her generation. She has 3 children. Sophie is the oldest, she's 21. Taki is her younger brother, who's 20, and then Anna is the youngest, who's 16, so the young teenager, and that's the stories about them. And they also have a poet named Michalis, who's a kind of wild leftist itinerant poet who people know him as sort of the radical poet, and he's always getting into trouble. And so this is who the family is that I'm writing about. And so I'll start with Sophie, who is going off to a party at her new boyfriend's house. She snuck out of the house to get there, and this is where we'll begin. The party was at Maximum Blair with students everywhere. Oh, and this is April 1967. Women in miniskirts flirting with men in tight jeans and slim shirts. Sophie could hear the excitement in the loud music and the clink of ice in glasses, the profusion of words and ideas, and the overlaying thing nobody spoke of, but everyone felt: sex. The yard vibrated with the combined heat of politics and passion. The elections were slated for the next month at the end of May. Would the king allow the elections? A woman with a large purple flower in the middle of her dress wanted to know. She sipped her drink through a straw. 2 young men nodded eagerly. On the house's large back porch, bodies Sophie didn't recognize moved closely together, and Sophie brushed through the crowd of chirping girls, barely managing to survive yet another squad of men, and was neatly dragged to dance by a short, insistent law student with wild, curly hair. Nick. Where was Nick? Their situation wasn't exactly clandestine, but it wasn't open either. He was 2 years her senior, having finished his undergraduate work in chemistry, and was now planning to study medicine abroad. But even had he been a student, their paths wouldn't have crossed much because Sophie was studying French. She didn't know exactly how he spent his days because mostly she met him in the middle of the night. She had noticed him at several student-based political meetings, and they had officially met marching in the center of Athens, day after day, supporting former Prime Minister George Papandreou. Their physical connection had been so strong that it was embarrassing, the way they kept brushing up against one another, like aloof but aware cats. The first time Nick drove her home and kissed her outside the arched gate to the yard, she wanted to drag him up to the roof. Instead, she went inside alone and didn't fall asleep for a long time. 2 nights later, she snuck out of her house and met him in a park, and there began a pattern. But mostly they met up in groups, and then they'd sneak away together later, after she was allegedly safe at home. But a relationship? She wasn't sure if she wanted it. The sex was entangled with the urge of their commitment, which seemed to spill into bed, and sometimes when they made love, she saw him speaking, and sometimes when she saw him speaking, she couldn't help but think of his arched body. In the parlor, a group gathered around a young man dancing zembekiko. One student strummed a guitar, another played a bouzouki. People drank wine and raki out of goblets and tumblers that seemed reserved for special occasions. A few gathered around a baby grand piano, but no one played it. Sophie wandered through the large manicured garden. Rows of lanterns threw eerie, lovely glows across people's faces. She approached a small bar set up in the corner where Nick's cousin Lucas, home for Easter, was pouring himself a cheap-looking yellow whiskey over shards of ice. Then she went back inside. In the center of the dining room was a large teak table. The chairs had been pushed against the wall, and a group of students assembled a newsletter, spreading the leaflets around the tabletop and poring over them like generals planning a war. Glasses, coffee cups, and ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts and pistachio shells studded the sides. Any degree of formality the room usually held had been temporarily suspended. For the next few hours, they drank and danced, and she enjoyed the glow of the evening. No matter where Nick was, Sophie was aware of him, beneath a huge ancient fig tree, underneath the trellis covered with grapevines, or dancing with others in the crowd. While Nick mingled, flirting with girls who beamed at him, he always found her again, and she felt an odd charge from this jealousy, and liked this approach and retreat, a dance in itself. Before her friends could tell her they were going to a club in Kypseli, she caught Nick's eye, and he motioned for her to follow him. They slipped through the tidy maze of vines and apricot trees, back around the house to the side spiral staircase, and up to Nick's bedroom. Though it was late, the party had hardly quieted, and a group of guests gathered around a small bonfire in the back garden. When Nick opened the shutters, the flicker of the flames delineated his face. Just the two of them now, and Sophie stepped out of her shoes and pulled her dress over her head. Nick watched her from the window, and then he moved again toward her. In the dark, the two of them fell together, in secret, once again, hushed, attentive, close and ready. But suddenly came the sounds of men shouting, nothing more than the noises of persistent revelers, they assumed, the whoop and fuzz of late-night second winds. Until they heard a sharp scream, not celebratory, but distressed, at which Nick lifted his head. The fire of a gunshot brought him out like an animal into traffic, and within seconds he was on the large terrace, pulling on his shirt and pants almost simultaneously while looking over the edge. Sophie dressed and hurried after him. First came a surprising silence, like the beats between a concerto's slow movement and its louder, faster finale. The bark of voices and slap of footfalls and panic start of motorbike engines. Chaos. Nick urged her to duck and motioned for her to follow him into his parents' bedroom, which faced the street. They kept the lights off and peered out the windows. Soldiers with rifles surged through the front garden, around the side of the house. Sophie and Nick watched, speechless, as more soldiers entered. Nick headed toward the stairs, ready to run down, but Sophie grabbed his hand and stopped him. The newspapers, the flyers, all those things on the table, she said. But it's too late. They could hear noises coming not only from below, but from down the street as well. The roof. We'll be able to see what's going on from there. Sophie pulled him to the back terrace. Unlike her own home in Hellenic, no staircase provided easy roof access, so Nick grabbed a chair and stood on it to help her up. Then he climbed up himself. Together they crawled across the flat roof to the front of the house, where they lay side by side looking down into the yard. They watched astounded as friends were handcuffed and thrown into trucks, the menacing growl of their engines filling the night while others tried to scale the wall. Sophie moved to get up and Nick stopped her. "Just lay low," he said, his arm arched over her like a fence. "Oh God," he whispered, "my parents." "Your parents what?" Sophie asked. The sound of her own voice frightened her. "My parents everything," she said. Maybe they'd come for Nick's parents, but the whole mess of bearded and denim-clad and miniskirt-wearing student radicals they found instead was a veritable windfall. And his was not the only family targeted. In a house down the street, many lights were on, thrown open in a careless rage. More men in black berets stood in the burn of the headlights. A large truck and a few jeeps crammed with more soldiers filled the street. A man and woman in pajamas and handcuffs were being forced into a large black car. The motorcade moved down the road, stopping further down. Vigilantly, methodically, yet as casual as the postman going door to door. Shouting, shouting. There was so much shouting. In the distance, a dog barked, croupy and erratic, and after another short and swift gunshot, it stopped. Okay, so let's move across the town now. So Sophie's been out all night. There's been now what seems to be a coup. And meanwhile, back at her house, she's no longer there. So now I'm going to go to her younger sister, Anna, who's just waking up the next morning. And Anna is 16. In the northern Athenian suburb of Hellenic, at the end of a block lined with citrus trees and bitter laurel, 16-year-old Anna woke to the early wobbly light and morning sounds that usually lulled her insomniac self to sleep. The clink of spoons against coffee cups, the scattered shifts of frequencies and squawk of stations as her mother adjusted the radio. These familiar sounds reminded her of being a child and listening to her father do the same. Sometimes in that in-between time of sleep and consciousness, she thought she could still hear him, swearing when he couldn't get a strong signal. On these mornings, she would wake with an even deeper sense of his absence, which sometimes lingered into the afternoon. That morning, she heard her brother Taki trudge into the bathroom and then flap down the stairs. His dry voice already rambled at this early hour, but Anna wasn't sure about what. The radio grew louder. Instead of the usual morning program, Anna heard military music, a strange choice for any time, let alone breakfast. She rubbed her eyes, rose from bed, and set her bare feet on the cold tile floor. The morning was cool, but soon it would break into April's midday warmth, and Anna was reminded that Easter, then summer, were just around the corner. Her neighbors were having breakfast on the veranda wearing sweaters, but the small radio in front of them played the same music that sounded downstairs. She waved at them and they nodded back at her, looking a little grave. She found her mother and Taki at the table, sitting completely still and staring at the radio as if it were a television. Anna had walked into not her kitchen, but a painting of it. She didn't ask questions. With the stir of the upcoming elections, the recent street demonstrations, and an overall restless populace, Anna had been on edge for weeks, and she had come to know the nighttime workings of the house as if she were the director of a play and the stage a cross-section of the dwelling's 2 levels, like the dollhouses she played with as a child. Anna usually heard Sophie run the water full blast while she brushed her teeth, and Taki wake to take an unbelievably loud piss without lifting the seat. She knew Sophie often climbed from her terrace down to the garden, barefoot so her landing would not sound, and disappeared, slipping into a pair of shoes she kept behind the shed. Shortly before daybreak, just when Anna's eyelids were finally growing heavy, her sister would return. Around this time, their Uncle Michalis either woke to get a drink of water or was just himself returning home. He stood by the back door to let their new cat Orpheus in from its midnight wanderings, and Anna heard his gentle calls, psst, psst, psst. She liked the image of their uncle expecting the cat and instead discovering Sophie, emerging from behind the shed, bleary-eyed, barefoot, undeniably sheepish. But Anna had finally slept and missed the usual nighttime routine, and the bizarre, frightening news coming from the radio alarmed her. She went upstairs, but instead of finding her older sister in a tangle of sheets, her eyes covered with a lavender mask, Anna faced an empty bed with neatly made corners. No, it wasn't because Anna had finally slept. She hadn't heard Sophie, because Sophie had not come home at all. Excuse me. So what happens now is Anna breaks the news to her family that Sophie has not come home. There's all these warnings on the radio saying, everybody stay inside, you'll be shot down without warning. Eleni gets out from her kids that Sophie has a new boyfriend. He lives in Psychiko, which is a suburb nearby. And so Eleni, not knowing anything about where this guy lives or what his last name is, just gets in her car and starts driving. And so that's the section I'll close with. In April, fecund and green, Athens erupts with life. The trees rustle in the wind, and hyacinths and lupin bloom in the parks. In the summer, the land is sun-baked and dry, resigned to a barren calm. But in the spring, it writhes and it kicks. There was a particular smell of the city at this time of year that Eleni had always associated with spring, a heady mixture of earth and spice and wet foliage with a hint of gasoline. But now, she'd forever associate April with something else. That morning, Eleni drove aimlessly through the winding streets of Psychiko. At every corner, she encountered police, there one day to protect, the next to inspect. They stopped cars, checked identification of passengers and drivers, and sometimes searched the trunks. Each time she was stopped, she affected a bored look when she rolled her window down, as though all this fuss were of no concern to her. Yet her pulse raced. A question, a wrong look, an impudent response could make her sound guilty. With her political history and that of Christos, her departed husband, it wasn't as if she were above suspicion. Each time she was stopped, she was told simply to go home, and each time she said that's where she was going. The neighborhood was winding and dense, with its grand houses set back from the road, their lush entry gardens hidden behind walls. Large trees loomed over the streets. The avenue seemed deserted, but in her chest, Eleni could feel the distant thunder of trucks. The barrel of a tank peeked out from a narrow street, and she diverted quickly onto an even quieter road, worrying the hum of her engine was too conspicuous. Surely there were people in all these houses, having breakfast, drinking coffee, listening in shock to the radio. But you wouldn't know it from the outside. It seemed the entire neighborhood had evacuated. Realizing the road was a dead end, she quickly turned around in front of a magnificent yellow house. This one, she wondered, looking a moment at its empty porch before driving away. Eleni continued to drive up and down the streets that had not been blocked. Now she almost wished she had bought Sophie the Vespa she had been wanting. At least she'd have something to spot. Because what really could she be looking for? An abandoned hairband? A purse? A shoe on the sidewalk? Sophie didn't ride a bicycle, and she didn't have a car. Before knowing he was in this neighborhood, Eleni had no idea where this boyfriend lived. She now couldn't even remember his name. She tried to temper her anger. Sophie could be in trouble, and Eleni felt a horrible tightness throughout her body, in her temples, her stomach, her chest. She imagined her daughter's face approaching these officers, accusing and confrontational, afraid of nothing. Eleni fought the urge to go to Dimitri, the man she had been seeing for the past year. He lived not far away, but as adults with separate pasts, they kept the workings of their household separate too. She didn't want to involve him, but more specifically, she was embarrassed to tell him she had no idea where her daughter was. Finally, Eleni turned toward home. Her daughter was okay, she thought, trying to reassure herself, only unable to call because the lines were down. She had simply not used her judgment. Eleni had certainly not been the perfect 21-year-old. This was just bad luck, getting caught at a friend's house. And speaking of poor judgment, here she was endangering herself by ignoring the warnings on the radio. At the next intersection was a greengrocer. Eleni was about to continue when she noticed the grocer in his store standing near the front windows. He stared at her as if he didn't know whether he should hide or wave. She stopped the car and got out. The sign read closed, but when she went to the door, he opened it for her. She could hear him playing the Greek military radio. She hoped more out of astonishment than allegiance. "You're open?" she asked. "No," he said. She could feel him watching her, wondering what she was doing driving around. "Well, may I buy a few things?" If she couldn't find her daughter, she could at least make sure the rest of the family had plenty to eat. Greek mother. Who knew what would happen next? He motioned for her to get what she needed. In the cramped store, she gathered more than they could probably eat before it went bad. As much as she hated to waste food, it was worse not to have it at all. She felt a horrible sense of déjà vu back to the Nazi occupation, during which many, including her grandparents, had starved. She added rice, macaroni, and 2 bags of lentils, and was suddenly grateful for all the tomatoes, green beans, and olives she had canned and stored in the cellar. As she cautiously moved through the narrow aisles, the grocer didn't take his eyes off her. "You shouldn't be out," he said. "It's not safe." "I'm headed straight home," she said. "I'm a doctor," she added. "Night shift." For some reason, this or the fact that her stocking up indicated her preparation for a disaster made him warm to her a little. "Have you heard anything?" he asked. "No more than you," he said, motioning to the radio. "They took my brother last night," the grocer said. "My nieces are staying with us upstairs. One of them won't leave the closet." His shoulders slumped a bit, as if admitting this made it a little less frightening. "As soon as I find out where they're taking him, I'm going to show up there and I'm going to raise hell. I just don't want to scare the girls." Eleni watched his lips move but didn't hear anything else. She had been so preoccupied with her missing daughter that somehow she had dismissed the idea of Michalis being arrested. A nihilistic poet was sure to be high on the list, though her brother seemed to her such a free spirit, she couldn't imagine his being considered any sort of threat. Then again, he was no longer the 10-year-old boy she sometimes imagined him to be. "You've been very kind," Eleni said. She paid him. He handed back her change. "It's nothing," he said. But they both knew it wasn't. She loaded the bags back into the back seat and drove down a few more winding streets of the neighborhood until she reached the same police checkpoint again, though this time the officers were not so indifferent. When she showed them her ID, one of them recognized her. She remembered the mole on his cheek, the reek of his cologne. "You just passed here," he said. "Now where are you going?" 2 other officers stepped closer to the car. A third stood on the other side of the road, smug, smoothing his mustache like some comic strip villain. "The hospital sent most of us home," she said, "because of the..." She wanted to say curfew or coup, but stopped. Perhaps it was insulting to these soldiers who had caused this. Or maybe they liked having this power. Then she added that she had stopped for groceries. Her nerves made it hard for her to stop rambling. The police officer looked her up and down, and Eleni tugged her skirt over her knees. To verify her story, she pointed to the snake and staff on her front window, the mark of a physician, but the man's eyes were still on her legs. "Step out of the car," he said. Slowly she did. He made her stand on the curb. Then he crawled into the back seat where he pawed through the bags of food, spilling much of it onto the floorboards. Behind her, only other one car waited, idling. Normally at this hour, the side streets would be teeming with cars, people headed to work, negotiating the neighborhoods to avoid the traffic. But as she waited for the man to decide whether her second pass or those groceries were enough to detain her, she wondered if stores had been forbidden to open. Would they ask her to turn the grocer in? And then she noticed the silence. No cars, no horns, No buzzing of motorcycles or people double parking. Just the sound of the officer grunting as he heaved himself back out of the vehicle. He slammed the door and shook his head to the other officers. Last time, he warned her. Go home. Thank you, she said, ashamed at her deference. She got back in the car, and he waved her forward. Then, by way of dismissing her, he banged on the trunk, as if slapping her ass. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming and for listening. I'm happy to take questions or talk with you if you like, or we can talk one-on-one, however you want to do it.
Does anyone have any questions? Tell us more
About me?
and this real feel you have for what you just told us.
Well, I think, so I knew I wanted to write about Greece always when I started writing, because it was always in my imagination growing up. And I think like a lot of Greek teenagers do, or Greek American teenagers, I spent one long summer not working, just hanging out on Santorini and meeting Greek boys and going to clubs all night. And I, of course, fell in love with the whole country in a different way, not from going with my parents and being with my family, but just sort of experience it for myself. And I knew that it was that time of your life when you're young and impressionable, and it just really made an impact on my imagination. But I wasn't writing it. I knew I wanted to write, but I wasn't thinking that clearly about what I would do with my life. Then when I started writing, I knew I wanted to write about Greece, and my father started telling me these stories of, it's amazing when you ask your parents for stories or your grandparents or relatives, the things that come out so late. And in my 20s already, when he knew I was interested in writing, my late 20s, I think, he said, my uncle was a pretty well-known Greek poet. And I thought, have we missed this? How has this not come up in all this time when both my brother and I are writers? And I think it's because my father's an engineer and he was trying to get us away from that side. But so my father's uncle was a poet named Michalis Katsaros, who, among, I think, poets of that generation and writers, they knew him. He was always in the central square. He was, kind of outspoken. Some might call that crazy, but outspoken. And his poems had a certain kind of air of resistance to them. And even now, when you go to Syntagma, and 2 years ago, when Syntagma was taken over by the protesters, the tent city, his poems were hanging in the square. And so I thought, this is fantastic. And then he said, oh, and by the way, he was living in our basement for a while with the composer Mikis Theodorakis because they were best friends. And I was like, what? How did we not know this either? And so all these family stories started coming out of all these, major figures in Greek culture and whatever. So I started thinking, I've got to write this down. The novel started as sort of a buddy novel between Michalis and Mikis, like a composer and a poet living in a basement. But I found that my heart wasn't into it. I may get back to that, but I was more interested in the family, particularly the women who were living in this family, or the young women, the teenagers. And so I started thinking about the way that personal and political things I don't see them as separate, and the way that a family living under a dictatorship, even if they're not feeling the effects every day, they're going to feel the effects in some way. And I think some families more than others, depending on where you fell on the political spectrum. My dad's family was, left of center, and so I think they felt it more than maybe somebody else who wasn't noticing it. So I wanted to write about this period, and so when I started writing the novel, I just started thinking about these characters, about the girls in the family in particular, and the poet of Michalis, and so that's where it started. But I was born at the end of the junta, so I obviously didn't live through it. I didn't live in Greece for any long period of time besides summers doing research, and so it was, it's really an act of the imagination. But I did do as much research as I possibly could have. And when the book is finished, I always would run into people who were historians studying the period and say, oh, if I only had met you 5 years ago. But yeah, so that's where the book came from, I think. Other questions? What happens to him? Yeah, that was about 150 pages I cut out of the book. And I was trying to do, I had Taki living in Ann Arbor and going to the University of Michigan, and also had him for a while living in Detroit. And I liked his character, but his character was so close to who my father really was that I couldn't access it. I almost felt it was too close. The other characters were acts of the imagination, and they were based on his sisters, but I didn't know them as well. So I found Taki very difficult to write. Taki was also the most right-leaning member of the family. His politics were much different than the rest of the family, which is why he wanted to leave Greece. His parents were getting arrested, things like that. And so I really liked him as a character, but I feel like he needs his own book, a separate one. But he was in the book with a pretty strong point of view. And it felt like the emotional heart of the book was not in the States, it was still in Greece. And so it felt like I was dividing my my creativity, I guess, in that way. I couldn't quite focus on him. Also because I found that his absence became such a presence. And I think even in my father's family, they were so aware of my father having been the one that left, and I don't think they ever got over it. And so I think the idea of abandonment can sometimes be a larger presence than him actually being there. So that's why he doesn't really have his point of view anymore in the book, though he did, but many drafts later he got cut out. Thank you, though, for the question. Also, I find it more difficult to write men, I think, at the time. It's easier for me now, but. Any other questions? I'm working on a novel now. It's set in contemporary Athens during the current crisis. It's about a Greek-American historian in her mid-30s who finds herself living there. And I'm trying to make it a little bit more, I guess, tragicomic in a slightly different style, but it's very contemporary, so there'll be a lot less research except being there and having to go to Athens every summer, which is horrible. But, yeah. Both, I think, both. I'm interested in a lot of the people I know who are living in Athens, but they're sort of between both worlds, either expats, like Greek Americans who've moved back there, people who found themselves there from other countries, and the way that the different way people's lives are being touched by this. I mean, in some ways the middle class has been completely decimated, and in other ways some people's lives are going along as normal. And other people are just completely, out of luck. But it's an act of the imagination, definitely. But one of the characters is an artist. She was a very minor character in the first book, in her early 20s, and now she's in her 60s, and she has a big retrospective at one of the museums. And as I was writing it, I imagined and I based it on an actual artist who had a show. And in the book, I had written a section where it gets vandalized. It's outside, it's an installation, it gets vandalized, and then 3 weeks later, this actual exhibit got vandalized. So I started to feel like I was writing Greece into this disaster. So I feel like I have to write it out of the crisis now. But so it's actually some of the things that I've been seeing as imagination are actually happening, which is frightening. Things with Golden Dawn and everything else. But I mean, some of them you could see them coming a mile away, so I'm not claiming any kind of prescience.
That are part of the Golden Dawn?
I don't think I can access that point of view at all, and I don't want to give it a point of view, actually, but there will be a presence in the book, the idea of the way the immigrants are dealing with Golden Dawn, absolutely, but I won't have a character from that point of view. I can't go there. It's reprehensible to me. Reprehensible, I can't even give it a voice. Yeah. Natalie will. She's a minor character in the prison camp, and she's the artist who's now in her 60s, and maybe some others in slightly different ways. But it's really a new book, but I want to make some tie-ins just for fun.
What did you say you based it on your family? What are your family's reactions to it?
Okay, well, my father hasn't read it, and he will never read it, I don't think. But he's happy to give it out to his friends and send them, things about it. But he won't. I don't think he'll ever read it. His wife has read it. My mother has read it. My family in Greece has read it. And their reactions have been very positive. Although some of them, my aunt's husband had said, all this time she was here, she was writing a book. I mean, he just still he sees me as like a child who, how does she make these sentences? But most of it was positive. I think for my dad though, it's not so much that he doesn't want to see the way I see Greece. I think for a parent to see his child accessing, I mean, not a child, I'm a grown up, but to see your child, no matter what their age, accessing points of pain or sadness or isolation or loneliness, I think it's too much for him. I think he tries to act like a tough Greek father, but I think it's too much. And I think he doesn't, when he comes to reading, he always says, why don't you read a happy story? Like, I don't have happy stories, so what's the point of telling a happy story? But anyway, so my family overall reacted positively, and my dad likes to give the book to his friends, but he'll never read it, I don't think. And that's fine. I'd rather they didn't read my work, actually. So. The sex scenes, everything, it's embarrassing, Yeah. Any more questions? Yeah.
I thought that the book is wonderfully written, and for it to be a debut novel is really exceptional. How's it being received?
I think it was received really well in Greece. Strangely, I thought I would get murdered there. I mean, I thought it would get torn apart. It was really received well there, and I think here it's been pretty well received. I had some snarky reviews, and I had some good reviews, but overall, I think the reception was good. The interesting thing was so many people who I met who read it said I had no idea this was going on in Greece at the time, and I don't know if that's an excuse or not, but I don't know if it's about American insularity or just we had so many other things going on, Vietnam and everything else, that it just wasn't in the papers. And they said, it was never in the papers, but I did so much research. It was really in the papers. It was in the New York Times. It was in, Life magazine. It was everywhere. Quietly, but it was everywhere. Amnesty International reports and things. So I think it's you focus on. I mean, if we think about, name the countries that are in our imagination right now, we might think, okay, Syria or Egypt or something else. But there's so many things happening in the world that we're just missing. I think even if we're well informed and try to be aware of events. So a lot of people didn't know, and so in some ways I felt like it's a book of fiction. I don't mean to present a history lesson. It's about a family, but I think fiction can bring to life things that otherwise get missed, and that's what I believe in art to do that. One more question, or? I grew up in Michigan, yeah, a suburb of Detroit. Yeah. I also went to University of Wisconsin for a while. I went to Michigan State University. I was studying science. I was studying zoology. I started a PhD program in Madison, Wisconsin in physiology. I was just lost. And I wanted to be a scientist, and I really like science. I like, science and writing are very similar. You're supposed to ask questions. You have to be creative. You have to pursue a path of reasoning that may not work. But my heart wasn't into it. I'd be in the lab at midnight doing my experiments, and I'd be reading the New Yorker or writing a story or something. And so then I dropped out and started working as an editor, a science editor, and then I started writing stories and taking classes at night in fiction, just just for fun. And then I got a portfolio together and applied for graduate school. But a lot of writers start graduate school a little bit later. 29 to 35 is not a strange time to do that because you need to have something to say. So I felt like a late bloomer, but a lot of people in my class were, my age. Yeah.
Do you think you could close by reading one more passage?
Sure. What should I read? Okay. Let's start with. I'll start with a short passage where it's been after the coup. I'll read from Michali since I haven't read from him yet. He's the poet. The night of the coup, he's at a party, and he's at his best friend Evan's house. He and Evan have a very difficult relationship. They love each other, but they hate each other. Evan is a literary critic. Michali is a poet. And they've had a lifetime of sort of misunderstanding between them, but also a lot of history. And so when he is at this party, he gets mad at Evan and he takes off and goes walking up Likavitos drunk. When he's up there, he sees the tanks coming in down on the streets through the telescopes, and he comes back down, has nowhere else to go, so goes back to his party. Meanwhile, his wife who he's been separated with for about 3 years. She's been living in Thessaloniki teaching, and they've been sort of not divorced, but not quite living together, has come back to Athens, and she finds herself there at this party. And so they're reunited, kind of surprisingly. And so I'll end with that moment. Reuniting with one's estranged wife is never without trouble, though one way to do so with minimal altercation is during a military coup. And when you've known each other since you were teenagers, Michalis thought, decades could pass with minimal communication and countless damages, and you still could find some sort of comfort in each other. Add political instability and fear of arrest to the equation, and there they were, Michalis and Irini sitting across the kitchen table from one another as if it were any Friday afternoon. Except that it wasn't. Together, Evan and his wife Simone, Michalis and Irini listened to the dreadful things the radio was blaring that morning, the military marching music interspersed with a harsh voice that hailed the coup as a triumph against immorality, communism, and atheism. People were told to stay home, stay quiet. Many streets were closed to traffic, and phone lines remained cut. Yet friends in the neighborhood dropped in anyway to share some sort of news. One friend of Evan's had been on his way to the airport when the taxi was stopped and told to turn around. They learned a friend of Simone's had been arrested, as well as a neighbor's uncle who was a member of parliament. A voice on the radio announced the numbers of the articles of the Constitution that had been revoked. Anything defending the right to free speech was annulled. They no longer had any sort of protection from arrest. These things were announced as casually as a weather forecast. Late that afternoon, after the visitors craving news had stopped arriving, after it seemed they had learned all they would learn that day, they encouraged one another to rest. Michalis lay in a small upstairs den, the lights off. The couch pulled out into a bed, though Michalis didn't bother. Sleeping on a couch held a certain lure of familiarity. Simone, holding a clean set of sheets, was a bit quick to offer Irini a bed at the other end of the house. Irini followed her, looking back at Michalis, saying, "We'll talk more about this later." Whether she meant the state of the country or the state of the marriage was unclear. She had always wanted to discuss everything until she hadn't wanted to talk about anything. In fact, Michalis was sure his inability to talk finally made her desist, detach, and eventually depart. A poet who won't articulate, Irini often said. Brilliant. Now she was staying in Kifisia, in the old villa she inherited from her aunt. A perfect country escape tucked away at the end of a dirt road, the place was modest but charming, and thinking of it made him nostalgic. He and Irini often visited her aunt there. Some nights after dinner, the two of them, still young lovers, climbed to the roof to stare at the night sky. And from there, the stillness and beauty made them feel as if they were in another world. Right now, to be in another world sounded ideal.